up, everybody? Welcome back to How We Got Here, a deep dive look at racism in America. My name is Tariq Burton, and I am with Justin and Sahara Avery. Our goal in this series is to help others identify how racism functions in our society today. We believe if you can see it for yourself, you'll be a better advocate against it. If a picture speaks 1,000 words, a real-life situation must speak millions. I mean, you can have 10 people describe one situation in 10 completely different ways. And it's possible that they be telling the truth about that one situation with no contradictions. But when it comes to discussions about racism, multiple truths about that topic don't seem to be viewed as a possibility, especially in a world of politics. It's so easy to get caught up with trying to figure out who is right and who is wrong. Some things are obviously wrong, but a lot of times we are all discovering critical pieces to the same puzzle. Systematic racism is a pretty complicated issue, so it shouldn't surprise us to hear that there are many truths that contribute to the solution. When we look at it that way, it's a little easier to see that a topic as complex as racism actually needs a multi-dimensional perspective to even begin to understand it and successfully address it.
You know, admittedly, it's a really tough challenge to do this. But, fortunately, I love challenges. And, we were really given one by a really dear friend of mine. He's an elder in my church, Jerry Sugarman. He suggested that we become fluent in opposing views, regarding racism in America. The people don't agree with what we're saying here. Truth be told, as a black person, frankly, you're exposed to opposing views about your race all your life. You can't escape it. But, I decided to make an extra effort to go into more detail about it. And, if you took a critical thinking or a debate class in college or high school, you learn that there's this foundational teaching that you're expected to know the opposition's views to your premise so well that you could persuasively argue their position for them and win. I believe in that. But I would add that you shouldn't just know their arguments. If you want to address racism and potentially solve it, you have to understand people themselves, the humanity behind the opposing views that they've taken. My hope was to discover not just what they were saying so that I can argue against it, but why they were saying it. I want to know why their ideas are so meaningful to them. So I listened to about 50 hours of interviews, podcasts, videos, articles I read. It took about 20 pages of notes roughly. And I was just really trying to understand in depth what people who disagree with me were saying and why. I researched people like Candace Owen, Thomas Sowell, Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, Larry Elder. When you listen in this way, you end up learning a lot of unexpected things. But before we go too deep into what I discovered, I think it's important to mention that there's some observations that I did walk away with in general. And then just like in episode 1, I found that there are some stumbling blocks here in the path of understanding that we have to move out of the way before we can get very far into that discussion. So here they are. There's 4 of them. Incomplete arguments is what I call them. And strangely, even though I agreed with a lot of the points that these people were saying, something still felt very wrong. And I was trying to figure out what that was. But then I realized that there was a consistent list of issues that they addressed. And there was a consistent list of issues that they didn't address. And it left me with a lot of unanswered questions. And those questions that I had, they actually were approached with. And they seem to often be dismissed as leftist propaganda or maybe anecdotal circumstances that don't really matter. But then when I stopped to think about it, I noticed that you see that happening in progressive discussions as well. So both sides seem to have valid points that neither of their opponents effectively address with any amount of meaningful detail, right? So stick a pin in that. We're going to get to exactly why that's important in just a moment, but let's get over to the other stumbling blocks here. The second one I call the straw man syndrome. When people debate in the media or online, they sometimes paint these exaggerated caricatures of the opposing views, rather than an accurate portrayal or portrait of the concern that their opposition is actually bringing up. But then they address the caricature rather than the issue itself, the straw man, if you will. And so they're not really addressing the issue itself. And so you never really get an honest and accurate solution or answer. Addressing a false portrayal of an idea can only produce a false and ineffective solution. I get this kind of preaching to the choir vibe rather than a true effort to understand. And so in that environment, it's really hard to understand somebody's points because you feel attacked or condescended to. You have to really work hard to listen past that. And sometimes, in my case, it takes a really long time before you begin to identify where they're actually coming from. But as I did this, I grew to like some of these people very much, actually. I think my favorite conservatives at this point are Thomas Sowell and Coleman Hughes. I really like Coleman. He's a humble guy. But I grew up around many black men who think and speak just like Thomas Sowell. I mean, the cadence of his voice and everything, it sounded the same. So I found myself quite nostalgically at home with his reasoning and the way he spoke. But when it comes down to it, our views really actually aren't that far apart. And I think there's a lot we could do if the different sides put our heads together. But this rarely ever happens between the different schools of thought, between progressives and conservatives. And in this episode, we call it the politics of racism. We're going to discuss exactly why that is and how to actually avoid that. I think we've solved it.
Is systematic racism a myth? A major challenge to understanding systematic racism is the belief that somehow it's non-existent. There's a lot of discussion that's happening out there and a lot of opinions being thrown around. And to be honest with you, it's quite alarming how many of them reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the term systematic racism and how it functions within society. Some people even conclude that it doesn't exist, that it's a myth. If you listen closely, however, you will find many of the same people who claim that systematic racism doesn't exist often do not demonstrate a clear or correct definition of the term itself. We're going to have a very hard time finding something if we can't clearly describe what it is. I mean, how do you know what we're looking for if you don't know what it looks like? There's an old saying that states, if you aim at nothing, you're going to hit it every single time. This dynamic happens a lot when people debate the existence of systematic racism. If we're going to solve anything at all, we have to be operating from the same crystal clear definition of the problem. The simplest problems are impossible to solve if everyone has a different definition of the term.
So the first thing we need is a unified clarity. So pause the video for a second here and absorb the definition of systemic racism. I'm going to post it right here. And so in other words, here, this is what we're saying. Stop making up your own definitions for stuff. History has already defined this topic in graphic detail.
If you add up all we have discussed at this point, we can clearly make a case that systematic racism is no myth. We are currently living within it, and it is indeed infecting every single one of us at this very moment.
Another thing to make clear is that it's a misnomer to call racism a political issue. Racism is based on human cruelty, the way one person treats another or how a group treats another due to their skin color. Politics and cruelty are two separate issues. Granted, it may require government involvement to make changes, but the issue itself is a humanitarian issue. Politicians and TV critics go back and forth like a football, but them talking about racism doesn't make it any more political than I could become a bird talking about pigeons. No, racism is strictly a humanitarian issue, and it should be treated as such, even if it's talked about in the political world.
So, the goal of this episode is to figure out how to be clear on these issues of racism, systemic racism, without being swept up into a political way of thinking about it, without believing in myths about it, and without painting condescending caricatures against the opposition. And finally, to be able to do so in a way that actually solves all the issues that revolve around it. Yeah, it's a really tall order, but I think we figured it out. But to understand it, we need to be clear on two key concepts and how they function within this debate on racism. And the first is science, and the second is morality. Now, we're going to deal with science first. There are several categories that all scientific methods of measuring and processing data come from. Empirical studies, we have sociological studies, we have psychological studies, and we have environmental studies. So let's take a second to define all of these so we know exactly what we're talking about, okay? The first one is empirical studies. Now, that's mathematically based research. Now, here is where we look at numbers and we evaluate statistics. Fair enough? Then we have sociological studies. Now, this is the study of social groups and how they interact together in various conditions, right? And then, very similar to that, we have psychological studies. Now, this is the study of the individual mind, or in an individual's behavior and how it's affected while experiencing the world around them. And lastly, we have environmental studies. Now, this is where we look at the circumstances that might be beyond anyone's control or beyond any group's actions or individual actions. It's like the region where one is born or the socioeconomic conditions that they're navigating. Now, each of these disciplines instruct our perspectives regarding the outcomes that we see in our society. And it's critical to note that none of these disciplines on their own are capable of describing a real-life circumstance in its entirety. They can only describe part of it. And why? Well, it's because life is kind of complicated like that. Again, if a picture says 1,000 words, a real-life situation says millions. And with any given situation, there are a lot of relevant topics to describe. The separate scientific disciplines collectively address all of that relevant content. So let me put it this way. I was given this really beautiful plant for Christmas last year by one of my customers. And, I watered the plant on time. I did. It was the right amount for the right amount of days for about 60 straight days. And, suffice it to say, I did what I thought was right. But suffice it to say, my plant died a horrible, gruesome, slow death. What happened? I was flawless in my faithfulness to supply the water that my plant needed. You see, my rightness on that one point is irrelevant to my ignorance of or my failure to consider or hold in equal value other factors that affect the survival of that plant. It needed sunlight. It needed a peaceful environment to grow in. It needed animals that weren't chewing on it, things like that. And it needed nutrients, of which I provided none. So while I was feeling great about myself for doing what I knew, my plant was slowly dying. So there's more to a plant's survival than the one thing I know, right? Or take this, for instance, for example, Pablo Picasso, creating this masterpiece. Imagine him creating that with only purple paint. It's not so masterpiecey anymore when we look at it in that way, is it? Or here's another one. Or how about trying to solve a 1,000 puzzle piece with only one piece? It's kind of goofy when you think about that way. In each scientific discipline, though, it offers a perspective that serves as one color in the larger painting, their own separate puzzle pieces, so to speak. Or perhaps maybe each discipline represents just one criteria of many that keeps that plant alive. They're individual pieces that are part of a greater whole, and they're meant to function in coordination with one another to arrive at a proper understanding of a situation, right? Regarding racism, you can't just focus on one perspective here and have your understanding be complete. If you separate them, or if you choose one while ignoring the others, you will create a distorted and incomplete perspective, leading you to distorted and incomplete conclusions. Most of us instinctively favor one of these scientific ways of processing information over the others. Now, that's not wrong. We just need to be humble to the fact that if taken alone, our naturally favored perspectives will lead us to a non-reality if we don't actively seek out to complete the whole picture by giving proper weight to the other perspectives. For example, empirical data is useless without the correct context. Sociology and psychology and environmental data are what give empirical data its context. They work together. So it's problematic when you look at statistics and assign your own meaning to them. For example, the unemployment rate of 1933 was 25%. I could say, that's a high number. I could say, what was wrong with everybody? Why are they too lazy to work? See right there? I just added my own incorrect context right there. assuming that no one was looking for work. See, I didn't bother to refer to any sociological environmental data. I assumed my own, made-up context. But if I looked at the sociological and environmental data of that year, I would see very quickly that 1933 was the dead smack middle of the Great Depression. See, that is the correct environmental and sociological context to that 25% number. So now we see that it wasn't because they were lazy. It was for reasons completely out of their control. So again, these perspectives have to work together. Statistics can be deceiving because they represent a numerical truth. Statistics are hard to lie about, but they don't represent a complete reality until a truthful context is provided. Here is where the deception happens. When we get our hands on something that's verifiably true, like a statistic, we often mistakenly believe that that's all the truth there is. But there's clearly more to consider. It doesn't mean that the stat is wrong. It's just not yet defined. And all those considerations must be viewed as a whole, and that's what the various disciplines are meant to do. When we do life, we don't just use one method of understanding our way. We use a lot of them. We use many. As a parent, I've got 3 kids. One would hope for the discernment that allows him to apply the right perspective to the right child at the right moment to meet the specific need of the moment. It's pretty easy to get that wrong, and we do that as parents all the time. But for the empirical-minded parent, imagine using statistics alone to raise your teen daughter. Or how about psychology to decide which box of cereal to buy? How about using environmental circumstances to determine how much money you have in your bank? It all sounds really silly if you get it wrong. And life just wouldn't make sense if you didn't take the time to discern the balance between these perspectives. See, we do this all the time, but we get it wrong when you see people discussing racism online. They take one discipline like empiricism, the stats, and they call that narrow sliver of information facts. They ignore all the other information and then use that to conclude whether or not racism exists. Doing that will never, ever lead to accurate conclusions. And incidentally, let me say this. When people say that they're presenting facts, there's a subtext to that. What they're really saying is that they're presenting you with the only facts that matter in their opinion. I generally see this from empirical-minded people, but others do it too. The truth is a picture says 1,000 words and a real-life situation says millions. There are more facts to consider than what is found in empirical data alone. There are sociological facts, there are psychological facts, there are environmental facts, and there are empirical facts. And they all play a critical role in accurately describing any given situation. Again, when looked at exclusively, these perspectives give you a distorted, incomplete view, leading you to incomplete and distorted conclusions. So let's apply this concept to some real-world numbers happening in society today. The number of reported unarmed Black people killed by police in 2020 is 8 per million. The number of unarmed white people killed is 2 per million. Now, one can't help but notice that 8 people out of 1 million is a pretty low number. 2 is even lower, of course. The empiricist is likely to say that statistically we live in a safe country where the odds are that you will not die as an unarmed citizen in the hands of the police. That is a statistical truth. However, society doesn't function empirically. If it did, then people wouldn't fear flying. They would be more afraid of being on the freeway or in their own bathrooms because those statistics are higher. We function behaviorally. In other words, we're affected by and will respond to what people do more than by how many times they do it. See, we don't need more than one life-threatening situation to know that we should avoid it for the rest of our lives. So it doesn't need to be a statistical thing. It's just once. The actual ratio is very low. Again, 8 per million, that's very low. That's an empiricism perspective. But the pattern of behavior, the sociological, for example, that ratio is interesting. Listen to this. It says, 8 versus 2 per million. It says that police can kill 4 times the amount of Black people than white people. Historically, that there's been little to no accountability for doing so. Now, what do you think the psychological impact of knowing that information would be on that group of people. They're seeing this happen and play out. Statistics and empirical data lacks the ability to recognize the psychological and sociological impact of that number, being an unarmed human, being killed by one who is assigned to serve and protect. It's not about the numerical ratio count. It's about the significance of the number itself. To an empirical mind, it'd be nothing. While unfortunate, the numbers are not so bad compared to the overall police encounters, and so we should feel good about that. But the behavioral sciences would discover quite quickly that these events, as small in number as they may seem, are powerful enough to damage the public's trust in law enforcement. To know that you can be killed under false pretenses in this country with impunity by police. You see, knowing this information will cause a society to begin to vilify the police as an institution, possibly even riot, and we've seen this happen. Why? Because the number of wrongful deaths due to misbehavior in the police force, they don't need to outweigh the peaceful encounters before we conclude that there's a problem that needs fixing. How many white cops kneeling on a black man's neck for 8 minutes until he dies does it take to spark an entire population into action? Apparently, just one. And in the case of George Floyd, we only needed that one instance of that kind of behavior sprawled out on everybody's phones to see that that's not the kind of society that they wanted to be and to sit by and allow that kind of thing. Not even once, even though we know it's happened many, 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 many times. We don't need a huge ratio to act. Why? Because while it is a fact that the overall ratio is low, it is also a fact that allowing that to continue on any level is not the kind of society we want to be. See, a strictly exclusive empirical focus on the numbers will cause us to miss that. It causes us to miss what is being revealed about the character of our society and how that character is affecting us all.
How you feel about that matters in a free country, okay? I'm speaking this as a scientist, but as a person who lives in the real world, okay? There's what is philosophically true, logically true, and then there's what's actually happening. The fact that that happened at all is a problem. Mm-hmm. That should happen 0 times, mm-hmm. All right? That should never happen, ever. So you can say it's 0.0002% and we shouldn't worry about it. I don't care what the percent is. That should never happen. That matters. Sometimes small things are big things, and they don't lend themselves to pure statistical analysis. There's certain things that should simply never happen. Can't look at how small the numbers are, given how dangerous it is, the capacity for that to erode the confidence that we all need to have to maintain a law-abiding society.
So Neil struck a really good balance here. Here is a celebrated man of science who has not lost his humanity for the sake of his empiricism. His human connection hasn't been surrendered to his science. He acknowledges they're connected in a balanced way. What he's saying is that there comes a time when the statistic, no matter how low, it ceases to matter. Statistical outcomes can never address who we want to be as a people. The number doesn't have to exceed 1 in order for us to say, never again.
The death rate of COVID-19 in the United States as of December 2020 is 0.0047%. This is super low percentage. The empirical analysis alone would not suggest to worry about it, but when you work out the numbers with how many people that have contracted it so far, that's 3,600 people who died per week. The empirical analysis is woefully disconnected from the real world effects of losing that amount of people. That's equivalent to 9/11 happening every single weekend throughout the year. And that doesn't begin to speak about how the other emergencies who can't get care because the hospitals are at full capacity. But there's so much more to the picture than that. How we behave in our effort to manage this disease and our response to the death of 3,600 people will tell us what kind of society we actually are. Who we choose to be as a nation has consequences. Some might take pride in the low statistic, but others will lose trust in their personal safety under the care of those who run our country.
What Neil is referring to here says that societal cohesion in the character of a society is dependent on trust. Trust is not always something that is detectable by empirical analysis. It is, however, explained by other disciplines. He is saying that all perspectives of scientific collection of data matter. Empirical data alone can't accurately measure the character of a society. It can only tell us what is happening without context. Therefore, by itself, it's not a good tool to determine if there's racism or what we should do about it. This is because racism is a character trait, not a ratio. But the behavioral sciences can reveal who we are as a society. It is a really good tool for determining where racism is. And to get a clear view of our society, we need to look at more than just numbers.
And I find that many in our society are using only statistics to determine whether or not racism exists. This is incorrect. And to get a clear view of our society, we need to take a look at more than just those numbers. It doesn't mean those numbers don't mean anything. It means that they're out of place if they're the only things you're using. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson also says, small numbers can sometimes mean big things. And that's what we're talking about here. They sometimes reveal potent facts about our society that strict numerical comparisons will never show. Yet, what they reveal is absolutely critical. And in the case of systemic racism, it must be observed with a multidisciplinary lens. Otherwise, you won't be able to see it or address it with any kind of clarity or effectiveness. And this inability to use a multidisciplinary lens is what I'm seeing in our national discourse on racism. Some people can't see or identify racism because they're looking only through one lens. Suffice it to say, if you're an empirical thinker, you should not be searching out more like-minded people to agree with you. On the other side, if you're a sociological thinker, you should not be searching out more sociological thinkers to agree with you. You should be searching out the other disciplines to find out not whether you're right or you're wrong, but how your ideas function in conjunction with the others together. All of the disciplines, they function this way. Only when these disciplines are balanced can we be effective at solving systemic racism. Now, that is the science aspect of it. Now, the other part is morality. And in morality, we're going to talk about wisdom versus folly. It may not make sense at first how wisdom and folly compare to racism and politics, but stick with me here on this one because it'll be clear in just a second, okay?
We keep going back to biblical perspectives on this, so I appreciate your patience if you don't subscribe to that kind of a thing. If that's the case, I believe that we can at least agree on 2 points. Number one, wisdom is important, and number two, we as a nation don't really seem to be living by it. Our national moral compass tends to be profits and material success. In the context of our discussion, wisdom can be defined as the knowledge of all the disciplines and perspectives they provide, coupled with the ability to use them effectively. Job 34 verse 4 says, "Let us discern for ourselves what is right. Let us learn together what is good." Allow me to hone in on this word together. We all think with different perspectives, which is not a bad thing. However, the scripture suggests that wisdom is found by putting all of our ideas together and using them collectively. On the opposite side of wisdom is folly or foolishness. Now remember how we said earlier that most of us naturally favor one of those scientific disciplines in our understanding of the world? While it's natural to do that, a foolish person will only pay attention to and respond to his or her own perspective. They don't seek out other perspectives to add to their own. This effectively cripples their understanding, limiting their vision to what they can only see in front of them and no further. Ezekiel 13:2 and 3 says, "Woe to the foolish prophets who follow their own spirit and have seen nothing. The idea of foolishness is that a fool only values, listens to, or reacts to what they can see in their own spirit, so to speak. They are known in the Bible for making really poor choices because they do not consider the things that may be outside of their worldview. And because of that, King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 10, verse 1, even as he walks along the road, the fool lacks sense and shows everyone how stupid he is.
I love that scripture. It's hilarious.
The scripture is pretty clear. We can see here how wisdom, the ability to collect and effectively use various perspectives, is important to apply when we evaluate our society and try to solve racism. Hopefully, we can see how important it is to have it. And hopefully we've convinced you to seek it.
But now that we've laid all of that down, let's talk about politics and how that factors into all of this. Now, the primary tool for successful politics is division. And I find that the art of politics is generally to separate these four perspectives, these four scientific ways of understanding the world, into mutually exclusive industries of thought and policy. In other words, they separate groups of people by teaching them that only one perspective can be right, hence left and right. And they have identified that fact that we are all predisposed to think with one scientific discipline over the others. And they're taking advantage of that. So again, it's not necessarily wrong to have that disposition. It's just that whenever you hear someone talking in terms of the left or the right, they are artfully separating you into those groups so as to organize their own voting demographic block. And by doing this, they're creating groups that inherently have a distorted and incomplete evaluation of any given situation that they're addressing. What I'm saying here is that in order for politicians to be successful, they need you to be unwise. They need you to see only that which is directly in front of you and nothing else. They require a perspective from you that does not lend itself to discerning the other disciplines. So when you hear them use words like narrative, propaganda, agenda, radical, extreme, leftist, alt-right, whenever you hear these words, they're essentially trying to make you suspicious about the other perspectives. Those are their catchphrases for those other disciplines. Why would they do that, you might ask? They're trying to convince you to be unwise. That is, they're trying to deter you from being open to considering all of the disciplinary perspectives. They're trying to limit you to just one because, frankly, votes are their primary concern, not solving social issues. And it's easier to manipulate votes when the group you are dealing with only has one perspective. I'm not here to judge their hearts for that. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm only here to say that if you do what they do and you follow their direction, wisdom will fall out of your reach. And the things like systemic racism will be impossible for you to understand or solve. Subscribing to this kind of political manipulation is to conform oneself to the biblical definition of foolishness. The sad news is that we as a country have been committed to a life and society that relies on this isolation. And political leadership has a stake in keeping it that way. So here's the bottom line. Progressivism is not capable of solving racism in our country. Let me say that again. Progressivism is not capable of solving racism in our country. Neither is conservative or any other political interests. The only thing capable of solving racism in our country or anywhere in the world is wisdom, and that ability to evaluate a situation using multiple disciplines and then balance those perspectives into a logical path forward. And at this juncture, sadly, we don't have anyone in our national leadership who's actually doing that. But more importantly, the goal in this episode is to teach our friends and whoever else is listening and willing to listen is to seek wisdom over politics. We arrive at wisdom by first being humble to the fact that reality consists of more than just your way of thinking. And when you know that your way of thinking is but a tiny fraction of the whole picture, to the degree one is humble to that fact, he will likely be able to seek out a more complete picture. And above all else, We have to understand that our predisposition to choose a side or isolate ourselves to one way of thinking, it forfeits our ability to discover and use wisdom. So please, do not forfeit your wisdom. So to understand racism in our society, it requires a combination of all the scientific disciplines, empirical, psychological, sociological, and environmental studies in order to construct a clear picture of what's actually happening. Our political system, it's designed to keep that from happening. To actually solve our problems, we must together discover how all these disciplines and perspectives work within the same environment to produce the results that we're looking at, like tending the plants, creating that masterpiece, or like putting that puzzle together. This ability is literally the biblical definition of wisdom, while the political route to solving racism is the biblical definition of foolishness. So, before we can get into any discussions about identifying or solving systemic racism, let's just make sure we're doing this one thing. We're being wise. So, that is our discussion for today. So keep in mind that we're not professing to be right about everything here, but we are trying to do what's right. And we're trying to help as many people as we can to think more clearly about these issues as we can. We're trying to walk that path of wisdom. So if we get something wrong, please show us the error. And leave a message in the description. You can give us an email to this channel. If you know me personally, hit me up with a text. Let me know, okay? We want this discussion open. So if you disagree with us on anything, any aspect of this stuff, help us out. Help us to complete this picture, and you'll do us all a world of good. Now, I know that we talked about a lot, and I know this is a lot to consider, so take your time and refer to the text of this discussion by clicking on the link in the description below. So, until next time, I love you. We'll talk soon.
If I knew that when disaster happened, there are responsible people making sure it will never happen again, and then you revamp so that that doesn't happen again. What matters is your confidence that people care, that they're trying to not have it happen again. And we haven't seen that. We just haven't. Great changes in society, particularly progressive changes, are never just handed to people. I think that's one of the great shortcomings of modern civilization, that to do the right thing requires bloodshed,